Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to Peaceful Families Project webinar, Domestic Violence and the Law. I am very excited today to have as our guests Imam Mohamed Magid and Aisha Rahman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Peaceful Families Project for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, and then I'll introduce our speakers and tell you a little bit about how we're going to run the webinar today. So for those of you who may be new to Peaceful Families Project, we are a national domestic violence prevention organization. So we focus on providing educational materials, training, and resources to address domestic violence primarily in the Muslim community. So I would invite all of you to visit our website, peacefulfamilies.org, for an ever-growing number of resources. We've produced quite a few new resources during this time of the pandemic. So I do invite you to, look at our resources, reach out to us if you need anything, or we can help you with any of your training needs. I'll start by introducing Imam Magid. Well, both Imam Magid and Aisha are no strangers to Peaceful Families Project. We've done a lot of work together over the years. And so it's, particularly fun for me and exciting to have them with us today. Imam Magid is probably known to many of you. He's the executive imam at the Adams Center in Northern Virginia, and he also has a national presence. He has been the president of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. He is currently also chairman of the International Interfaith Peace Corps, and the chairman of Muflihun, which is an organization that focuses on prevention of violence and hate. We are very proud at Peaceful Families Project to have him as one of our advisory board members, and he has actually started out with us since 2008 as a founding board member. He's co-authored 2 books, Before You Tie the Knot, which we wrote together. And he's also co-authored Ramadan Reflections. He's been featured in Time Magazine, and he's written for the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal as well. And he's received many awards, including the El-Hibri Foundation's Peace Education Prize in 2017. Aisha Rahman is also no stranger to PFP. We've met and worked together since Aisha was the executive director of Karama a few years back. And Aisha currently is a practicing attorney at the Bay firm as of counsel, and she has over 10 years of experience in family law. And she handles matters like divorce, custody, child support, Islamic marriage contracts, and other related matters. And she also continues to provide family law training to judges, lawyers, and advocates on a national level. So very highly qualified to be our speaker today. When she was the executive director at Karama, she established a pro bono legal service through Karama, and she, along with other attorneys, provided pro bono legal assistance to domestic violence survivors. She also has received awards and honors, and she was on the DC Pro Bono Honor Roll in 2012 and again in 2013 for providing pro bono legal assistance. So both Imam Magid and Aisha are really committed to the issue of domestic violence prevention and serving people who are impacted. We're going to allow them to do their presentations, and we'll take questions at the end. You can type your questions in the chat box at any time. But we will be reserving some time at the end to answer the questions so that they can go through their presentations. So, be patient. Sometimes the questions will actually get answered as the presentation unfolds. I'm going to ask that when you do submit your questions, that you avoid asking personal questions, like about a personal case that you have. We're not going to be able in this format to provide any kind of legal assistance or specific, like fatwa for your situation, but you can ask general questions about the topic that's coming up, and you can type those in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Aisha and Imam Magid.
Thank you so much, Selma. This is great. It's such an honor to be here with you guys. I wish that we could have seen each other in person, but I think this is such a beautiful alternative to be able to see people's faces and talk to one another around the country. So it's my great pleasure to be here, and it's also my great pleasure to be presenting with Imam Magid. He and I had participated in many Peaceful Families projects, Imam trainings over the years, and those were probably one of the most elucidating and rewarding presentations that we gave. I'll give one quick story just to take some privilege on that. So Imam Magid and I don't know if Imam Magid remembers, he does so many sessions around the country, but we gave an Imam training in Buffalo, New York once. And I think I said, and we're going to get to this topic in the presentation, but amongst the types of divorce that Muslim women can have, there is an exception for a talaq divorce, in that a woman can give a talaq as well if it is written in her marriage contract. We'll get to that. And I remember all of the imams' faces were kind of like, what is this lady talking about? Why is she mentioning that? No, a women-initiated divorce is called a khula. It's not a talaq. And Imam Magid said, she is right. She is right. And we had this beautiful discussion about it. And so it was a very, a lot of times in this work, we talk about allies, male allies, imams as allies in doing the work. And Imam Magid has exemplified that in his work. So it's my pleasure to be sharing this platform with you, Imam Magid. Just providing some contact information here for both of us in case you guys do have questions after. You can always contact us. Sister Selma already gave a disclaimer. I wanted to start by giving our own disclaimer on behalf of me and Imam Magid. This presentation is a general overview of family law, both in the US and how it relates to Islamic law, or how Islamic law relates to American law with respect to divorce and custody matters. While some of the scenarios that we talk about today may be based loosely on cases that we've done, we are protecting our client confidentiality and not revealing, of course, details about any particular case. And we don't want you all to take limited information that we're providing today, as Sister Selma said, and providing it or applying it to specific scenarios that you all may be experiencing. But if you have questions, again, we would be happy to have some question and answer at the end of the session. If you need legal advice or spiritual counsel, we ask that you seek the assistance of a licensed attorney in your state or county, and or the assistance of a local imam or scholar in your community. Particularly Islamic law, whenever we talk about Islamic law, it's very complicated. It's complex. It's not complicated. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made our religion easy for us, but there are many things to know about the faith. And so I want to always be very mindful that while we're giving some basic knowledge today, it is not, we encourage you to seek further nuanced understanding about Islam. I always start these presentations with some group norms. What I mean by that is, especially when we're talking about something so sensitive as family law, which involves people's families, their spouses, their children, it can be a very sensitive topic. And we want to be mindful of the fact that it's a sensitive topic. It can be. And talking about Islam is also sensitive. We don't want to, I certainly do not want to be disrespectful to the faith, but we want you all to know that as far as, and I'm going to speak for Imam Magid, as far as we are concerned, no question is a bad question. Feel free to ask whatever question you'd like. If it's an offensive question, we may tell you it's an offensive question. But no, in all seriousness, no question is a bad question. Please feel free to ask whatever you're confused by or want more clarification on. We really want you all to participate. So Sister Salma is moderating the chat box. If you guys have questions while we're speaking, in the interest of time and getting through the material, we'll probably not be looking at the chat box while we're presenting, but we're doing that because we're saving plenty of time at the end to do questions. And so if there is something that you're itching to ask, go ahead and type it in the chat box and we'll get to it. If it doesn't get answered in the presentation, we'll get to it at the end. And if you have any group norms of your own, again, I'm not monitoring the chat box, but we want you all to be respectful of one another, even in the chat box. And if you have any group norms for one another, go ahead and share in the chat box. Okay, I don't want to spend too much of time on this, but I wanted to make sure, especially for me and Imam Magid, just take 1 minute and share in the chat box the top 3 things that you want to make sure you get out of today's session. We want you to think about the following. 1, why did you choose to come here today? What are you trying to learn or get out of today's session? Another thing to think about is, what is an area in your practice having to do with Muslims or Islam or family law that you're struggling with, or maybe that you need advice or help on? Again, we want to make sure that if we don't get to a specific topic that you all are struggling with, that we at least capture that information in the chat box. If we can't get to it today in the Q&A, maybe we can have a follow-up session about it, or we can, have more communication via email about it. But really just want you guys to go ahead and let us know what you're looking for out of coming today. Also, I just wanted to note that we had a brief opportunity to look at who all is in the room. We know that it's not just, we have lawyers in the room, we have imams in the room, we have advocates in the room. And so we understand that all of you are coming at this body of work perhaps from different areas and angles. And so again, we want to be mindful of the audience and try to address any questions or concerns that you all have. Okay, so while you guys are chatting in the box, I'm going to go ahead and continue. Many of you may be aware that the root of intimate partner violence or gender-based violence is power and control. A lot of you, actually Peaceful Families Project was one of the first, or maybe the first organization to put forth a power and control wheel many years ago. That was the Muslim Power and Control Wheel that looks at how domestic violence manifests, particularly in Muslim communities. Obviously, we want to state here that this is not a Muslim problem. This is not a problem that has to do with any religion. Unfortunately, intimate partner violence spans all religions, races, socioeconomic classes, education levels. Unfortunately, it's a huge problem that really has nothing to do with one particular demographic. However, it does also impact Muslim communities, just like it impacts other communities. And so we see today's presentation is going to be a little bit of a focus on how it's impacting Muslim communities specifically. There are some ways that Muslim communities are unique than other communities. And so we seek to talk a little bit about that. But generally speaking, domestic violence and power and control can manifest through emotional or psychological abuse, physical abuse, financial abuse, certainly sexual abuse, and particularly in the faith context, spiritual abuse. So when you're talking about intimate partner violence or gender-based violence from an Islamic perspective, in my opinion, you have to understand, first and foremost, one of the most important tenets of Islam, which is that Muslims believe that God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who has all of the power and all of the control. We are all creation. We are all created by God. And so we have no control. We have no power that is without Allah's power. And so this idea of asserting your human power or control over another person is, to me, in my opinion, just sinful. It's not recognizing that you actually have no power and control, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has all of the power and control. So on that, I'll let Imam Magid, if Imam Magid has something to chime in on that issue.
Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. I would like to thank Peaceful Family Project of putting this together. As usual, they are the one who enlightening this community always in how to create a peaceful home, and appreciate specifically Salma and Aisha for their contribution always of training imams and helping us as those who are not familiar with the topic in depth to become aware of what all aspect of it, from the categories that just been shared with you with Aisha, Sister Aisha now in this presentation. I just want to say that Islamic law meant to help people, or Islamic teaching meant to help people to have a holistic, wholesome life. And people who separate any aspect of it from the idea of submission to all of God, not submitting to human being. And as Aisha was saying, connected the power of God, not the human power. As we do this kind of separation, we do disservice to ourselves and to others of explaining Islam and living Islam. Well, I think as we discuss this issue of divorce and law regarding divorce, we have to look at it from the lenses of this is an act of worship. You get married in marriage and so forth. Every issue of dynamic, or changing in relationship has to be connected to the idea of relationship with God Almighty, as relationship have two dimensions, vertical and horizontal. And therefore, the vertical relationship is to please God in everything we do, and horizontal relationship is connected to that aspect of relationship with God Almighty.
Okay, so on that issue, thank you, Imam Magid. Some of the just kind of basic understanding of Islam before we get to the actual issue of marriage and then of potential divorce, or of violence in the home. I think it's really important to establish just some basic understanding of Islam with respect to women and men and how we are created. So there's a verse in the Quran that says that women and men are created from the single soul. The Arabic word is nafs, N-A-F-S. And how it's been explained to me, and of course Imam Magid can chime in on this, is that while human beings are created from the same soul, and so we have the same spiritual obligations or spiritual relationship to God, we are different. We have different responsibilities. We may have different roles. We may have different strengths and different weaknesses that are not necessarily based on gender. It could be that some of us are very athletic. Some of us are not. Some of us are very good at math. Some of us are very not. Me. And so there are different strengths and weaknesses and different roles, but ultimately our worth as human beings is the same. Unfortunately, in the context of domestic violence, this issue gets confused. And one of the on the previous slide, when we were talking about spiritual abuse, one of the things that we hear as advocates in this field is one of the assertions of power and control is by making a person feel like they are irrelevant or lesser than, or not as significant, or not having as much value or worth, as if God created that hierarchy, which he did not. There are many verses in the Quran. We didn't include them here, but of course, there's a lot of foundation in Islam and in the Quran, which is which Muslims believe is God's word, as was given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And some of those verses do talk about how men and women were created from the same soul, from both the earth was populated, and both have mutual rights and responsibilities. So it's not that a man has all the rights and responsibilities and women don't, or vice versa. There's a lot of mutuality in Islam, and it cuts both ways. So that's, again, something to be mindful of when you're thinking about this topic.
Yeah, I just want, thank you, Aisha, really for singling out and mentioning this verse, which is the foundational. I think that when we think about relationship, it has to be based on this concept of single soul, which is lead to the concept of all of us being honored as creations of God. The issue of dignity, Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and honor and respect. That being in our mind, then when we look to the law and interpret the law, we have to have that basic concept in our understanding of any laws, especially when it comes to Islam, that the issue of the dignity and honor of human being. Allah said in the Quran, "قَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ." Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and honor and respect.
So in continuation so now we have this basic foundation that every human being is created from the same soul, and that every human being has dignity and honor. And then we translate that into the context of marriage and family. So we're here today to talk a lot about the family structure, the marital structure from an Islamic perspective and from a legal perspective. So again, we've kind of just picked a few verses. These are just a handful, not even. There are so many verses in the Quran and in the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that talk a little bit about what is the paradigm for marriage and family from an Islamic perspective. So certainly, these verses 30, 21, and 7, 189 talk about how marriage is about having affection, love, and mercy for one another. Another verse that Imam Magid and Salma have written an entire book about is that spouses are spoken as garments for one another. And Imam Magid can explain a little bit about that. Believing men and believing women are protectors of one another. And that's, again, one of the mutuality concepts. It's not just men protect women. It's mutual. We are protectors of one another. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his last sermon said that the purpose of marriage is companionship and partnership. It's not a service contract. Again, I think that this particular mentioning was kind of just to call out perhaps some patriarchal or misogynistic practices that were happening at the time that the Prophet lived, that particularly, men are not marrying women to wash dishes and do laundry. It's not to say that women shouldn't or men shouldn't do those things, but that's not the purpose of marriage. Again, to go back to the original verse, marriage is about affection, love, and mercy. It's a partnership. And again, a husband and wife maintain rights and responsibilities as a couple, but also as individuals, particularly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your obligations to God do not change necessarily just because you now are in a marital relationship. Imam Magid, if you have anything to say.
Yes, I would like to say that, we'll take the garments one, that you have to know this relationship is about building understanding, the respect, treating each other, as we said, with mercy and kindness, as we mentioned in the verse. But I said to people, you have to spend some time to know your spouse. Before you marry them, you have to know them, and you have to spend more time to know them. And I always make analogy, Salman and I made that in our book. If you have a garment and it says dry clean, and you put it in the machine, you're ruining it. And if you put silk and wool in the dryer, it shrink. Shrinking is called divorce, because you cannot able to have that garment anymore. You're subjected to so much abuse, humiliations. It doesn't fit you. It's not your garment. It cannot cover you, because you did not allow that to happen. Therefore, there's so much beautiful concept in Islam, and I know that we're going to talk about the legal aspect of this contract, but I'm so glad Sister Aisha also mentioning all of this verses, because this was marriage contract being built on. You know, those are the foundation of the marriage contract.
Mm-hmm. Great. So before we get into the legal piece, Imam Magid, if you would, a lot of what we do at Peaceful Families Project is to kind of talk about, we're going to talk about divorce and the legal piece, irrespective of whether there's violence in the home. But because Peaceful Families Project is working with survivors of domestic violence and advocating against domestic violence, I wanted to spend a little bit of time before we get to the legal piece about a verse in the Quran that is very misunderstood. And that's verse 434 in the Quran. And I'm going to let Imam Magid talk a little bit about that verse.
Yeah, there's the verse 434 in Surah An-Nisa. The title of the chapter is Women. And unfortunately, people don't read the Quran as one text. They read the Quran in, middle piece. They get a verse or a text in isolation. But when you read the Quran, you have to read the Quran from the beginning to end as one text. And now, in the verses that you mentioned, Sir Aisha, in the beginning, about one soul, that's the first verse in that chapter, actually, chapter of Nisa. Therefore, you have to interpret every verse in light of that verse. And therefore, this verse talks about the issue of the interaction between men and women and husband and wife at the time of conflict. But the verse has a key word on it called nishuz. And that's the word being misused and abused in the issue of divorce and ending of relationship. People used to say that this imra'a nashiz, there's a woman disobeying her husband, and they bring her what they call Bayt al-Ta'a, the home of obedience. They have to be forced to come to a relationship, and give all the power to the man in determining whether she can leave the relationship, whether she cannot leave a relationship. And people take that verse and justify violence against women. While the verse is the word nishuz in the beginning of the verse talks about the infidelity in the relationship. And there's many interpretation for the word daraba, as you know, from the classical fiqh and from the contemporary people that interpret that verse. But it's very important for all of us to take this home. Take the following. The Prophet, peace be upon him, has dispute in his marriage. There was a conflict in the marriage. But never, ever the Prophet ﷺ have used verbal or emotional, psychological, physical abuse. Ever. For there's no one understood Quran more than the Prophet, peace be upon him. And therefore, misusing this verse, which is many people come to me and they have misinterpretation of the verse, and they said, how can you say that Islam does not allow me to have a physical discipline of my spouse? They call it physical discipline. And I told them that you have completely misunderstood this verse. Your wife is not a child. Even a child is not allowed for you to physically to hurt the child or anyone. Rasulullah never hurt a child, never hurt a woman, not physically hit anyone. And he is a model and example. And therefore, those who justify physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, they completely misunderstanding the principle in which measure being based. And here, I want just to say very important things. No justification whatsoever. Trigger me, have pushed me, and so forth. No justification. I tell everyone listening, especially on Facebook, I want you to quote me. Don't tell me because COVID-19, I'm out of job, she triggered me. Wrong. You have no excuse. I'm stressed out, she triggered me. Wrong. You cannot justify any form of domestic violence because you say somebody else have done this to me. You have the control of your behavior. You have control of your hands, your tongue. And that excuse Allah will not accept it. Therefore, please, I didn't get the opportunity to say this publicly recently, but I'm going to say it. Don't let anyone to tell you that you are the reason of being hit. You are the reason of being abused. Don't say you make me do it. You have caused it to yourself. No, you have to know that when we commit domestic violence, when we commit abuse, we're hurting others and we're hurting our own soul. And therefore, please do not accept excuses of somebody have triggered somebody to commit abuse against them. Not acceptable. It's not acceptable. I wanted to say that for a while now. Public, I said it many times, but recently I want to say it, and now I had to get the opportunity to say that.
Thank you, Imam Magid. So just a quick note, again, on spiritual abuse. So part of what Imam Magid is really talking about, again, is manipulating and misusing the Quran or the Hadith to justify mistreatment. We also see other instances where, especially now, Imam Magid is talking about COVID-19. There's a lot of isolation happening. There's a lot of, people who aren't able to get out of the home to go and access community or access people who could help. But also from a spiritual perspective, we've seen a lot of ways of denying women, particularly, the right to go to a masjid or to get Islamic knowledge. The fear, of course, is that if you really understand Islam, then you would know your rights. You would know that Islam would never condone what's happening to you. And so this is kind of just a design. And one of the ways that abuse kind of manifests a little uniquely in the Muslim community. So just now kind of transferring or talking a little bit more legally. So of course, Islamic law is derived from verses of the Quran, from the sayings and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which we've been talking about. And it's also, there are a lot of scholars who for generations and generations have written about Islamic law based on those primary we hope, based on primary sources. So we're gonna now, talk a little bit more about the law. We already have been laying the foundation from the primary sources. But what are some of the abuses of Islamic law that we see in particularly in the American Muslim community? One way that we've seen an abuse of Islamic law is not granting an Islamic divorce, or likewise impeding a civil divorce. One of the things that I think Imam Magid has done, and I know that this is his practice at his center, is that the Islamic divorce will be granted, once the civil divorce is done, they'll bring the paperwork to Imam Magid and then an Islamic divorce is granted. There's people who believe that they can somehow keep you from getting a divorce, getting a religious divorce. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the divorce section, but that's one of the abuses. Unfortunately, we're seeing more cases of polygyny. I say unfortunately because from a legal perspective, I don't want to get into the fiqh issues. I think Imam Magid can get into that a little bit, but from a legal perspective, it creates a little bit of a quandary in the United States when a man is married to more than one woman, because only one woman is recognized in the law as a spouse. And in this country, that causes some issues with respect to rights to inheritance, rights to health insurance, rights to access to money, just kind of some practical things that a second wife or a wife that's not recognized legally may not have access to those rights from a legal perspective. They also can't get a legal divorce. And so one of the issues that we're seeing is that a lot of imams and scholars around the country are struggling with how to make sure that if you do have another spouse that's not legally recognized, how can we enforce a divorce and the MAHR and all of the other rights that come with being married when you're not doing that legally through the courts. Another abuse of Islamic law, or just a law in general, is we're seeing some just kind of just denial. We call it, taking a wife somewhere, taking a woman somewhere and leaving her there, taking all of her documents away. I see this a lot, unfortunately, in my practice, where the first thing when the marriage goes sour is to take IDs and passports and things away so that a person can't leave physically. So these are just some very few issues that we're seeing in the Muslim community. We've already talked a little bit about spiritual and sexual abuse, of course, from a sexual perspective. Particularly in the Muslim community, again, we're trying to talk a little bit about what happens in the Muslim community specifically. We're seeing, stories of forcing someone to watch or imitate pornography. I actually had a case about that yesterday. It was a Muslim couple, and the wife was being forced to watch and imitate pornography. She thought that was spiritually wrong for her to do, and it became an issue in the protective order case. Forcing sexual relationships when fasting or during your menstrual cycle, which of course you are given a reprieve from in those times. So these are just, again, issues that are particular to the Muslim community that we wanted to mention. And now shifting to the legal case. So if any of these things are happening, there are rights that you have to do something about it, depending on what you're ready or willing to do. Again, Imam Magid and I are not here to give you legal advice. We're not here to encourage you to do one thing or another. I believe in the autonomy of a survivor to pick and figure out what's best for them to do in their particular situations. But here are some of your options legally. In most jurisdictions around the country, you're entitled to get a protective order if there is an issue or incident of family violence. What that means, and again, a lot of you are practitioners in the field, so you already know what a protective order is, but a protective order is when one party goes to the courts, they make a petition that there has been abuse, that they're afraid for their lives, afraid for their safety, afraid for the safety of their children, with someone who they're related to. So protective orders are unique in the sense that they have to involve someone that you're related to by blood or marriage, or that you share a home with, that you're cohabitating with. Except in the instance of stalking, you're entitled to a protective order, again, in most jurisdictions, for someone who's stalking you, and you don't have to have a relationship with that person. Generally speaking, in protective order cases, so once you apply for the protective order, if the court believes you and feels that you're entitled to it, you'll get a temporary order for a couple of weeks, and then you'll have to go to a final hearing. And if awarded a protective order at the final hearing, generally it lasts for 1 year. One of the religious issues that shows up in protective order cases is around temporary support provisions or spousal support. So some people believe that in Islam, you're only entitled to spousal support for 3 months. If you're separated during your iddah period, we'll talk a little bit more about that again in the divorce section. And so, you know, a lot of times in a protective order civilly, because someone is seeking the protection and you're separating physically, sometimes people don't want to continue to pay the mortgage or to continue to pay the light bill or the water bill while you're separated and figuring out what you're doing, figuring out what's going to happen long term. So that's one religious issue that shows up. Beyond protective orders, you can also have, you can separate if you're not ready to be divorced, you're not ready to talk about divorce. There is a mechanism of legal separation, at least in Georgia, where I practice primarily, there is a mechanism for legal separation. It functions essentially as a divorce. You can do child support, spousal support, everything during that separation. And a lot of Muslims I have found, my practice, it primarily serves Muslim people in the Muslim community. A lot of people are very inclined to this legal separation notion because they're not ready to be divorced because of the stigma around divorce, because there's a lot of issues that there may be hope for reconciliation, but right now the situation is toxic and so they need a little time to figure it out. So that's an option that I'm seeing as something that's a little bit more common now. And then of course there's divorce. If you are in a toxic relationship or you no longer want to be in the relationship, then you can always file for a divorce. Imam Magid, I had a question for you here, and we can talk about it in the divorce section, but from an Islamic perspective, are you automatically entitled to support for a certain amount of time? Oh, Imam Magid, I think you're muted.
You're talking about that time of separation, of legal separation. Am I correct?
Time of the separation, yes.
Yeah, ulama said that if a woman being put in harmful situations and she left by herself or her family come and took her from the house of the marriage, or she prevented the husband from coming to the home, the husband has the obligations to maintain the household the way it is, and this is the fatwa from being Muslim scholars have been asked about these issues. Even when she's staying with her brother or her father because of the mistreatment of the husband, that does not let the husband responsibility goes. Like, he has to continue support and provide all the maintenance to the wife.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, that's one issue that often gets confused, and it segues us into the types of divorce in Islam. So we were talking earlier at the beginning of the presentation, there's 3 major methods for divorce in Islam. They're called the TALAQ, KHUL, and Tafriq. Tafriq is judicial divorce, which is not necessarily applicable in the American context. It's more applicable in Muslim majority countries where judges take Islamic law into account in making their judgment. But it tracks very similarly to a civil divorce in the US. So in the US, you're going to take into account the law of the land, the law of your jurisdiction, and make a decision based upon that. So the Tafriq, similarly in Muslim majority countries where Islamic law is the basis of law, you're taking into consideration Islamic law in making a determination about the divorce. In the first 2 methods, so in a talaq, generally speaking, it's a unilateral divorce initiated by the husband. I kind of gave away the answer to my own question here, which is, can a woman give a talaq? So Imam Magid has been talking a lot about the Islamic marriage contract. We're going to talk more about that as well. In the Islamic marriage contract, some people have quite complicated marriage contracts. Some have very simple marriage contracts. It is based upon the negotiations and conversations between the parties prior to the marriage. It's not a prenuptial agreement. I'll get to that in a moment, but it is a solemn contract entered into by two people upon marriage. And one of the things that, one of the rights that can be enumerated in an Islamic marriage contract is that the wife has the ability to also ask for a talaq. I find it very interesting. I learned about this, of course, when I was at Karama. Dr. Libri, the founder of Karama, talked a lot about having, I think it's called the right of the isma in your hand. I think I'll let Imam Magid talk about that. I'm Pakistani by ethnicity, and I handle a lot of Pakistani divorces. And it's so interesting because the basic contract that you get in Pakistan from the clerk, the courthouse, is it has a provision that the woman has the right to divorce. And every single one that I have handled has that provision crossed out or blacked out. So, I've asked many of my clients, why is this part marked out? And they're like, I didn't even know. Most people are like, I didn't even notice, or I didn't even read that to see that had happened. But upon further investigation, I learned that a lot of either the clerk will go ahead and mark it out before even handing it to the parties, or they will, the officiant, whoever is conducting the nikah, will mark it out in the ceremony. And so unfortunately, I think that's just one country, one example, but I think that there's not a lot of education given into the fact that a woman can ask for a talaq. And the reason it matters, and I think we talk about this, it matters because of the MAHR. Again, I'll let Imam Magid talk a little bit about this or on this topic, but essentially, just very basic, in a talaq divorce initiated by a man, he has to give the MAHR to the wife. MAHR is a marital gift. It's a gift promised at the time of marriage. Some people do it in two parts. They do a MAHR that is given at the time of the ceremony, and then there's a delayed MAHR, or they just do one fixed sum. Unfortunately, so the MAHR is not an issue of divorce. It's an issue of marriage. It has become an issue at the time of divorce because, unfortunately, a lot of people are not taking this issue seriously, and they're not giving the MAHR at the time of the marriage when it is due. And so at any time in the husband's life, it becomes a superior debt on his life. It is, so what I mean by that is, if he dies and hasn't given his MAHR, the MAHR goes first to the wife before any of the other inheritance or division of assets happens. It's the absolute right of the bride. It cannot be negotiated, and it can be negotiated by someone that she designates, but it's not to go to a husband, a father, an uncle, a mother, etc. It goes to the bride. And then I add here that it's not a dowry. That's a personal language preference here. Dowry to me is a very sort of Western concept of selling women into marriage, buying women from their families or their husband or for their fathers. And so the right in Islam is so much more beautiful than that. And we don't do that in Islam, of course. And so I don't call it a dowry, but I'll let Imam, before we talk about khula, I'll let Imam Magid talk about talaq.
Yeah, I would like just to frame a little bit the issue of talaq in the context of marriage. Of course, what I mean, but we define marriage as that aqd, which is the contract. And aqd means to tie something, to tie. to tie someone to a legal obligations. And that's why the word usra means a shield, to protect one another and so forth. If marriage does not fulfill its principles or the foundations that marriage contract meant to establish, then the ending of the contract, of the aqd, it's called releasing someone from responsibility. That's why it's called talaq. Talaq means to untie something. Aqd is to tie the knot, and talaq to untie it. And that's why the Islamic perspective of divorce is to call tasrihun bi ihsan. Tasrihun bi ihsan. Let me just explain this a little bit. Tasrih, the word tasrih, was also meant to free someone from responsibility. But the Quran says the tasrih bi ihsan, releasing someone from their obligations, from the commitment that they have made at the time of the marriage contract in the best manner and the most peaceful way. Quran also call it tasrih jamil, سرحكن سراحا جميلا. Ihsan and beautiful tasrih. That is the tasrih bi ihsan, which means releasing someone in the best manner, releasing someone in the best condition, ending the marriage in the best way possible. Another word, I call it successful divorce. There's a successful marriage and the successful divorce. How can you have a successful divorce? When the divorce being done in the way that people say, okay, it's not working, and the divorce is not a result of abuse, because that's a person now. The divorce is having justice and relieving abusive relationship. But say people no longer compatible, they don't see eye to eye, they grow apart, whatever it may happen, and then in that situation they have to separate in the most peaceful way. But if the divorce was because of abusive relationship, because a person have not fulfilled their obligations, that talaq al-qadi, meaning that being legally forced to end the relationship where someone have not fulfilled their obligations toward the other person. But say if people now, the difference between them becomes so much, but still they aren't being paid, no one have raised a hand on somebody, no physical abuse, no verbal abuse, no neglect, but they don't see to eye, okay? They don't like each other anymore, for whatever reason is. That is a time that this tasrih, this ending relationship, releasing somebody from the obligation of marriage has to be done in the best manner. Even, by the way, after the judge issue a divorce of someone who have been abusive and so forth and so on, that person has to now to rethink their position to say, I was abusive in my marriage, I was forced to divorce my wife, I forced to end the marriage relationship, and maybe I went to prison or being held accountable. It's still now, from now on, I have to repent. I have to correct my behavior. I have to now to try to amend that what happened after the divorce, not to go after the woman, not to mistreat her, not to destroy her reputation, not to have revenge of, try to restoring his reputation. They go after a woman's reputation. That's double sin. You're abused first, and the relationship ended because of your abuse. Now want to abuse somebody after they get divorced. Therefore, I just want to put that in perspective, because that's what I see in the Muslim community. Therefore, talaq is to release someone, untie the knot.
So that's not the only way to end a marriage in Islam. There's also a second method, which is called a khula. The khula divorce is usually, it is initiated by the woman. It becomes an issue who initiates the divorce on the issue of the mahr. So what we see a lot in the Muslim community is that when there is a khula, divorce, the scholars have said, and there's a hadith from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that talks about a woman giving back her mahr at the time that she is seeking a divorce. And so what has happened, I think, in the abuse context, one of the things that I've seen in my practice, and it's so interesting to me because a lot of Muslim couples, I say this not to be critical, but just an observation that I have. A lot of Muslim couples don't focus so much on all of the Islamic rules and obligations when it comes to getting married. But yet at the time of divorce, there is this like hyper focus on who is seeking the divorce, and it has to do with money. And it's sad because I think that what happens is, especially in the instance of divorce, a man will at times not file for a divorce on purpose and wait it out, wait for a divorce to be filed by the woman, so that when the divorce is filed by the woman, he can turn around and say, I'm not going to give her her mahr. She's asking for the divorce. It's not initiated by me. Of course, when it is initiated by the man, he has to continue to pay the mahr if he hasn't paid it already. And so this is what I have observed in the khula situation. Of course, there are times when there's not abuse happening, where a woman is seeking the divorce. And of course, she's entitled to do that. In terms of the process of that, you know, it's similar to the talaq. But in the context of abuse, this is what we're seeing. As Imam Magid already has said, that when there is harm that has happened in a marriage, there are still support provisions. So you're not released from your support obligations. But I think Imam Magid will speak to that.
Yeah, I just want to highlight three things. I appreciate what Aisha was saying about khula. The word khula, it means that the person says, I don't want you to be my husband, but I'm willing to give you back what you have given me, so to prevent abuse of mahr. Let me just explain to you the psychology behind this. A woman marry a wealthy man and give her, you know, a big mahr, or gift, marriage gift, or marriage, her rights of the marriage obligations, financial obligation. And then after 2 months, she said, I want to divorce you. And then she go and marry somebody else. And that was meant to stop the abuse of the mahr. That's why when there's no reason whatsoever, the guy treat her well, the intimacy, physical intimacy, there's no problem, socially no problem, and he's not abusive, he's not. And she said, I just want out. For the man have paid money into the relationship, meaning have, what I mean by that, he have provided the mahr, which is established the rights of the woman in her own money from the wealth of the man. And therefore, in the khul', she said, okay, listen, I'll give you the money you gave me back, and I want out of the marriage. That's the reason of the khul'. Now, I just want to say something about this issue of khul'. Please, those who listen to me now in this webinar, in the Zoom or in Facebook, we cannot abuse the word khul'. People abuse a woman. Let me especially speak about husband abusing a wife, and make her life miserable. And he knows that she cannot live in this marriage, but he will insist that he will not especially if he doesn't know English. He will not file for divorce. He knows that she cannot file her. She goes and find a lawyer. She doesn't have help to get out of the relationship. What he does, he said to her, listen, if you want out of this marriage, give me everything I gave you. And there's something called KHUL. And then they go to the Imam, and the Imam, without asking what's happening in the relationship, he grant a woman a divorce by giving her rights, giving the man money. Therefore, she been abused, and now she paying money to abusive husband to get out of a abusive relationship. That is really the triple injustice. But we have to say that this type of divorce, where the woman give back, the money was given to her to get out of the relationship, this is for the time that is nothing of concern at all in the relationship. She's just no more interested in him. Maybe she no more in love with him. Maybe she doesn't like just being his company. Maybe started thinking about, if I marry somebody else, maybe I'll be more happier. Whatever it is, but I was asking out of marriage was no reason whatsoever. That's why is the issue here to address the issue of the mahar when given to the husband. But you have to remember, in the time of abuse, a woman can get out of marriage without giving anything, but husband has to fulfill his financial obligation. That's called TALAQ al-Qadi, which is the divorce being issued granted for her. And that is divorce, if issued by the civil court, we do consider it in America as imams as a divorce. And we recognize that as Islamic divorce.
So on that issue of divorce, we've talked a lot about the marriage contract already here in this presentation, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the marriage contract from a American legal perspective. So I pose the question, is the Islamic marriage contract just a formality? Is it just a tradition? Is it even important in the American context? And I would argue, yes, both from a legal perspective and from a spiritual perspective. So from a spiritual perspective, of course, our religion, or the religion of Islam, is beautiful in the sense that it has established a precedent for writing agreements down. I think people who know anything about the world, it's a good idea to write down agreements, not because you don't trust the other person, not because you know that there's going to be a conflict, but mainly because life happens. A lot of things can happen. You may forget what was committed to. You may forget what the circumstances or the situation was when you agreed to a certain thing. And so, from a spiritual and from a legal perspective, the Islamic marriage contract, in my opinion, is not just a formality. Of course, the biggest part of the Islamic marriage, of course, is the nikah. And during the nikah, that you're making a very solemn vow. The most solemn contract that you're ever going to enter into as a human being is that of entering into marriage. And so idea of documenting it's beautiful from a spiritual perspective. From a legal perspective, we've talked a little bit about what provisions are in a marriage contract. As I said, it can be as complicated or as simple as the parties want. So it can be simple from the perspective of just saying the names of the parties, the names of the witnesses, and the MAHR provision. These are the essential elements of the contract. But if the parties want it to be a bit more complex or a bit more nuanced, you can put in, of course, that the woman has the right to give a talaq. That's one provision. A lot of people put in that if the husband seeks a second wife, then the first wife may be entitled to a talaq. These are just examples. You can put in anything that you want. I mean, it's an agreement made between the two of you. So is it applicable in American law? Yes and no. The provisions that are not in violation of public policy are applicable and enforceable in the American courts. So what do I mean by that? The fact that you've promised a gift to your spouse during the marriage is absolutely not a violation of public policy. In fact, in the United States, it's very common to give gifts at the time of marriage. There's a lot of case law about engagement rings, for example, and wedding rings, and do you have to return them upon divorce? That's one example in the American context that's quite common of giving a gift at the time of marriage. Lawyers argue under contract law. So they argue that this is a simple contract, like any contract, where there is an offer and an acceptance. There's not consideration in marriage contracts. The consideration is the marriage, of course, and that commitment that you're making to one another. And as long as you are of the right age, you are of sound mind and are not being coerced or forced to make a decision, this contract is viable and can be argued in American courts. Even if the marriage occurred in a different country, you can still argue for its applicability here under conflict of laws provisions and comity. These are legal terms that basically says as long as the marriage was valid in the state in which it occurred, it is valid here in the United States. So if the marriage was valid in Pakistan or India or Sudan or Palestine or wherever, if it was valid there, it's valid here. And so it can be enforced. Provisions that are not enforceable in American courts are like the bigamy provision. So in most jurisdictions around the United States, it is not legal to have more than one spouse. And so if you have provisions in your contract that talk about bigamy and what that means and what that looks like, you cannot enforce those, generally speaking, in American courts because bigamy isn't recognized and it would be a violation of public policy. But for the most part, the MAHR provision particularly is enforceable in American courts. Just the last slide before we get into the Q&A. As I said here, Islamic marriage contracts can absolutely be relevant in the United States. But one thing that you want to be aware of in a lot of these cases where we have issues of enforceability, you usually need an expert witness. So you need someone who can come in and testify about Islamic law and Islamic law around the marriage contract, around MAHR, etc. There's two, take expert witnessing seriously if you recommend it. There was a case in Virginia where an expert witness came to the court and testified that a MAHR is a bride price. Again, kind of talking about MAHR as if you are buying a woman in marriage. That case became quite well known. It was super problematic because the judge, made this declaration that, in Virginia, we don't sell women into marriage. And so it kind of contributed to anti-Muslim sentiment and this idea that Islam is backward or perverse, because it was a misunderstanding and a misexplanation of MAHR. So be very careful. I've also linked here, there's a case in New Jersey that was quite popular many, many years ago where there was abuse that occurred in a Moroccan couple. The woman went to the court to get a protective order, and she was testifying about the various kinds of abuse that she was suffering, including sexual abuse from her husband. And the husband brought an expert witness to that court date, and the expert witness testified that in Islam, a man has absolute sexual access to his wife, and that a wife has absolute sexual access to her husband. He did talk about the mutuality of sexual access and sexual rights, but what he did not talk about is that neither has the right to abuse the other sexually or otherwise. But based on that expert witness's testimony, the judge denied the protective order, saying that the husband lacked the intent to commit abuse because in his mind, what he was doing was valid according to his religion. Again, there was a reporter that was reporting on this case. It was actually a quite small case, but again, anytime you are vilifying Muslims, somehow people hear about it and they talk about it, and it was written about. And a lot of people attribute a lot of the anti-Muslim sentiment and the anti-Sharia bills that were quite popular in that era, in that 2008, 2009, 2010 era, to be because of this case. So, you know, the judge, in the aftermath, the judge was appealed on his decision, but many had written about it and said, look, this is how Sharia is taking over our courts, where a man can abuse his wife and because of Islamic law, you know, he won't be held to account. So just be careful about expert witnessing. Get someone who really knows the religion if you want that. And with that, I'll let Imam Magid have the final word, and we'll get into Q&A. And again, just our contact information, providing it to you all here.
Thank you, Sister Aisha. I would like just to conclude by saying there's many reasons of granting divorce in Islam. And most of those reasons are compatible with the legal system in the MAHR. For example, if a person been abusive, neglecting, disappeared, does not fulfill their obligations, all of this are the reasons for Islamic divorce. What the Fiqh Council of North America did, they wrote this long paper on issue of divorce. And the conclusion is that when people get married civilly, have a civil marriage, they have given permission to the court also to make decision in their marriage. This is TALAQ tafwid. And when the legal divorce takes place, and the man says, I divorced her legally because I was forced, but Islamically, I'm not going to let her get married to somebody else. This, by the way, is an issue that happened in the Jewish community and Orthodox community, where they establish arbitrations and so forth to make the legal religious judgment on the civil divorce. For me, if there's a civil divorce, the man have signed into that. There's no reason for me to believe that this person's married to that X or Y. And based on that, we will give them the Islamic divorce to confirm the civil divorce, so that the husband does not go and accuse a woman getting remarried that she married a man and she was already being married. I just want to emphasize on that and to end that there. Thank you so much.
I am not. Was I on mute, or were you able to hear me?
Sorry.
We didn't hear you. You were in mute.
I was on mute. Okay, so let me start again. So first of all, I was just thanking both of you for your presentation. It's very helpful. We do have some questions. One of the questions is about the 3 talaq. So you did talk about talaq, but the 3 talaq, and what is the impact of that? And if you can discuss that versus the legal divorce. There are 3 other questions, so I want to make sure we divide the time and make sure that we're able to get to all the questions.
Sure. I'll talk very quickly about the 3 times divorce. So as far as the civil legal piece, I think it's applicable to the Islamic piece in that most of the scholars that I have read do not take saying talaq 3 times in one breath or in one sitting as a final divorce. I'll let Imam Magid touch on that. But
why Aisha, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Aisha, but could you explain that first for the people who may not know what the question is referencing?
Sure. So it's quite common to, especially in abuse cases, like if you're in an angry situation, you should never talk about divorce from an Islamic perspective loosely or in jest, but a lot of times in anger, if you're in a fight or something, a husband may say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And the reason why this 3 times is significant is that in Islam, you can, if you say, I divorce you once, if a husband says that to a man, you can separate or you can still reconcile. There is still a period of reconciliation where you can go back to being husband and wife without any implications of being in an improper relationship. If you say, I divorce you a second time, after that first incident, you still have an opportunity to reconcile and to get back together and live as a married couple. If you say it a third time, you're done. It's bad and it's done. That's my understanding. Again, Imam Magid, definitely chime in. So the reason for that is, you shouldn't take divorce lightly. So it shouldn't be something that you're just throwing out there for the sake of throwing it out there because you're angry, upset in the relationship. And so this, God has created a mechanism by which if you've done this 3 times over time, you don't get infinite chances to say that you're divorcing somebody. Quickly on the issue of civil divorce, a lot of times people will come to me and they'll say, he said, I divorce you. And so, I'm going ahead and filing a divorce. And they always ask the question, can you get married again if you were to get civilly divorced? So that's the issue that comes up. I actually haven't posed that question to a scholar, because usually what happens is in the first time that a divorce is pronounced, you usually don't go ahead with the civil divorce if your intention is to reconcile. But Imam Magid, have you seen this happen?
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, in the divorce of 3 times in one setting, the school of thought like Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, they do recognize the divorce, 3 divorces, one as a final divorce. But you have the work of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim. They go back to the hadith of Rasulullah, where he's saying that he told Ibn Umar, who said he divorced his wife, said, if you divorce her in the time of her monthly period, then you have to go back to the marriage. That does not count. It's called TALAQ al-bid'i. TALAQ bid'i, TALAQ sunni. Bid'i meaning that divorce that does not follow the guidelines of the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the teaching of the Prophet, and therefore it is not considered the proper talaq or divorce. Now, if people get divorced, they have to get back in order to be divorced again. You cannot divorce a divorced person. If you're divorced, you started your divorce, and then people have to get remarried to get divorced or to get back into the relationship and to reset the marriage so that they get divorced again. We said in Arabic, لا يطلق المطلقة. The person being divorced is not being divorced, divorcing a divorced person already. The issue here that I just want to say that the abuse of the Islamic marriage versus civil divorce. What people do, a man wanted to get rid of the marriage, but he wanted to get it in middle piece, like in steps. But he told his wife, let us get married, to get divorced, civil divorce, but we are Islamically married. Because he wants to divide the asset. And therefore he wants to make sure that he has resolved that issue. And therefore, that giving her the hope that you're still my wife, well, just want you make sure that financially we agreed on things and so forth. And then she signed into that paper. The minute she signed into the paper, she said to her, goodbye. You're no longer my wife. I'm divorcing you. That people have to understand civil divorce, meaning ending the marriage with all its rights that you may have. That's what it is, because now we have no rights on and anything in this marriage. Therefore, or somebody said to his first wife, let me legally divorce you so I can bring the second wife from overseas. That woman had let go of all her rights with that civil divorce. I just want to explain that, the consequences of this whole issue, because this become unfair, imbalanced relationship. And many people fall in that trap.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of questions around the MAHR. I just want to mention that the Islamic Marriage Contract Resource Guide that we have on the Peaceful Families website does have references to case law and situations where the MAHR has been enforced in court. So that's a reference that you can use. Thank you, Aisha, for answering some of the questions in the chat. I appreciate that. There are a couple of questions around enforceability. One of them is, if someone does not have a civil marriage, only a Sharia or religious marriage, how can that person get their rights like mahar or muta or nafaqa? And the other question is something that we see a lot in cases of abuse, which is that the person who is abusive knows how to argue his way out of paying the mahar, may use, in the questioner said fake arguments, but we know that people do sort of use Islamic law, find loopholes and twist things, because abusers are manipulative. That's what their game is. And so they find a way out of paying the mahar, they find a way out of paying their obligations. So the question is what suggestions you have for that, and yeah, what do you advise there?
Magid, I'm going to let you, that's not in the civil divorce realm, so I'm going to let you handle that question.
Yeah, you're saying that a person want to get an excuse to be get out of the mahar.
So we see this all the time, right? That the person who is being abused is seeking legal recourse. The abusive person manages to wiggle around the law, outside of the law, denies the abuse. Maybe there's no police report to prove it. Finds a way also to navigate out of paying the mahar. And so just any suggestions?
It happens a lot that the whole idea of I will never divorce you until I die, it means like give me money. And Islam does not recognize marriage or accept enslaving people into marriage. Now, if she prove witnesses that of any kind of abuse, verbal or physical or emotional, even if there's no police report, that will be enough for the imam or the arbitration committee to make that judgment. It's very important that to make sure the process is fair, so that no one being accused being abused and he being abusive and he's not. It's very important also that the issue of mahar, person have to know there's a consequence in next life after we die, that is death. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said that the debt of the person who passed away has to be paid in order for that soul of that person to be freed. And that's why it's not permissible person to try to get out of mahar, especially postponed mahar, although as Aisha was saying, mahar have everything to do with marriage and nothing to do with divorce. if a person dies and there's mahar not being paid, had to be paid first before the inheritance being distributed. If a person had the mahar not being paid, divorce took place, has to pay that. That is separate from the issue of alimony, different from the issue of child support.
And so in the case of someone who doesn't have a civil marriage, so obviously if they don't have a civil marriage, they also cannot go through the court to get their divorce. What do you recommend? Is there any way that a person, a woman could get her legal rights, Islamic legal rights?
Yes, I think that if they go for arbitration in the local mosque, and hopefully that will be a fair process, that she is able to present evidence, bringing someone from her family, from his family, to present the case of each one of them, and that hopefully that will result in a judgment that fulfill the rights or bring justice to the person being wronged.
So one more question. I think, Aisha, you may have answered it from a legal perspective in the chat. But in the case, I hear a lot of people say that if they go through the divorce, they go through the court for divorce, the concern is that they might be awarded more financially than their Islamic right. Because many people believe that the woman is only entitled to the mahr. So Imam Magid, could you please talk about, what is a woman entitled to? Since our topic today is abuse, particularly if there is a talaq or khula or any other, dissolution of the marriage, what is the woman's right? Is it simply the mahr, or is she entitled to spousal support and any kind of distribution of assets?
Yeah, she's entitled of spousal support, called mid'at al-talaq. Is entitled of child support. Is entitled of her paid mahr. Is entitled for any asset that they build together as spouses, because she helped him to build the asset of the marriage. Anything after the marriage, not before the marriage. Especially if she helped him to establish business and so forth. All of that entitled of that, especially if she also contribute financially to the building of the house and the equity and so forth. There's a whole list in ulama of Sud says 50-50 if she helped him to establish himself, that she's entitled of that. Therefore, it's and by the way, just for people who might ask for evidence of the scholar named Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, he said that in any area where the majority of people you live in and the judicial systems run by people of other faith or secular system, he says that what agreed upon in the judiciary system in that society, a Muslim has to abide by the outcome of the court. It's part of respecting what they call public social order. And therefore, that's why this fatwa of the Fiqh Council of the civil divorce, considered Islamic divorce, come from.
Yeah, thank you, Imam Magid. It's really important because I know that even many women will not go through the court because they're so concerned that they might take money or be given money that's not theirs. And it's so important that you emphasize that Islamically women do have this right. It's not that, what is being awarded in court is not contradictory to our Islamic law. So I just wanted to underline that. All of a sudden, we have a lot of questions coming in now. And we're about at the end of our time because it's time for prayer here for Maghrib. So I don't know, Imam Magid, do you have a couple of minutes, or if we need to end now, what we can do is I can try to capture these questions and perhaps we can post answers to them.
We can have a couple of minutes, but
a couple of minutes.
Excuse you, I'm gonna break fast while you're talking. Okay.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your fast, Imam Magid, and thank you for being with us. while you're fasting. So if two people have done nikah, in other words, they've done the Islamic marriage contract and they don't consummate the marriage, and the woman wants out because of abuse or other red flags, is the man obligated to give the mahr? We'll do quick answers now.
Absolutely. You cannot get out of that.
Okay. Imam Magid mentioned a relationship between legal and Islamic marriage and divorce contracts in the United States. I'm wondering about cases where people have an Islamic marriage or divorce without legal registration or action. And also if they have the legal marriage or divorce without the Islamic marriage divorce. I mean, they intend to use legal issues for immigration purposes and keep or dissolve the Islamic marriage. Is this acceptable Islamically and related to abiding by any public social order?
It's not acceptable. Just I want to say something. There's some imams, I'm going to be very open, will officiate a marriage without marriage license, and they will not give a woman a certificate signed by them. And then they tell the woman, we didn't give you a certificate because this is called suspended marriage. Zawaj mu'allaq. There's nothing in Islam called zawaj mu'allaq. Please, if you violated the law and you get people into a relationship and you refuse to come to court and to say you married them, you take sense of ownership that you have a man and a woman have intimate relationship based on you telling them they're married, and then you're refusing to give a woman a piece of paper saying that she's married. Therefore, it's really very wrong to do to begin with, and that's not the way how to handle a serious relationship like this.
Okay. Last question, and then we're going to break. Before the last question, let me just say to everyone, since you're enjoying this presentation, and many of our presentations, about 70% of the material we produce is free to the public, and we do rely on your donations and your contributions. So please visit our website, peacefulfamilies.org. You can donate in a variety of ways through our PayPal giving fund, through sending a check, through Facebook. So please do that to support our work. We would love to offer more programming for you. So one question is that if the imam is an abuser and is involved in concealed marriages, do we have an institution that takes such cases to deal with, and what happens to an imam if proven he abused victims? So I'm going to post this resource in the chat, which is an organization called FACE that does investigate those kind of situations. But Imam Magid or Aisha, like to say anything about this practice that we know is quite prevalent of secret marriages and multiple, just sort of marrying and divorcing serially?
I think that all I will say on that is that a lot of work needs to be done. Of course, there's no perfect system. So, you know, when you're talking to advocates in this field, you know, we have seen, and I don't want to get too much into down the rabbit hole on this, but we've seen that law enforcement and responses of law enforcement are not always helpful to our communities. There's a lot of problems with law enforcement, but I think that, you know, for now, while we're still figuring out restorative justice models and whatnot in this country, you know, there is the option, if you choose it, to potentially report abuse cases to the police. That is a, you know, criminal issue to be abusing people sexually, physically, and abuse of power. So there's that option. As far as community accountability, again, I just think we have a lot of work that we still need to do. A lot of people in our community are not willing to speak against or advocate against people who are in positions of power. That's part of why people get away with it. And so, you know, community accountability is still something that I think the Muslim community is working on. And we need to figure out ways not to only, engage kind of in cancel culture, but figuring out ways that really provides justice to people who are suffering. So not just say, this imam or whoever has committed the abuse is a horrible person and needs to, yes, they don't need to be giving lectures, and yes, they don't need to be invited places, and all of those things are true, but really, we need to focus on the survivor and what they're suffering with and what their issues are, and really let them lead accountability efforts.
Thank you, Aisha. Imam Magid, would you like to have any closing words, and then we will adjourn?
Yes, I just want to say thank you so much for Peaceful Family and Salman and Sister Aisha for always bringing those kind of programs to the community. I want just to say to people, do not look to anything in Islamic law in isolation of the moral system and belief system that bring people to a comprehensive way of life, of understanding the relationship with the Creator, the relationship with others, and any kind of mistreatment of human being will impact our relationship with God.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you, Imam Magid and Aisha. Thank you to all of you who participated today. We're really glad to see that you were able to join us. And we look forward to you joining us in other programming that we have. Please check out our Facebook and website. We have lots of programming happening for you this month. Thank you all very much. May God protect each and every one of you and keep you safe. Take care. Assalamu alaikum, and have a good evening.